I can't laugh too hard.
Oh no, Jim ruined the opening by saying you can't laugh too hard, but that's okay. We are going to welcome you to the Rational Egoist anyway. And you can see we've got Jim Valliant here, and we today are dealing with reality. We're starting a series where we are going to go chapter by chapter from Leonard Peikoff's masterpiece, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, and we are going to show how this philosophy is ultimately a self-improvement philosophy. Jim, welcome to the show. I'm going to just begin by reading the opening paragraph from this chapter, the introductory. It's not the introductory, it's the first chapter. Philosophy is not a bauble of the intellect, but a power from which no man can abstain. Anyone can say that he disposes with a view of reality, knowledge, the good, but no one can implement this credo. The reason is that man, by his nature as a conceptual being, cannot function at all without some form of philosophy to serve as his guide. This reminds me, Jim, of Dr. Phil in his book Life Strategies. He says you either get it or you don't. Be one of those who gets it. And that to me is sums up everything that Leonard's talking about here. So what does reality? How should we look at reality? And why is it important that we have a view of reality?
Well, look, how about we take a look at various takes on reality? Now, the term that we use here is existence. If we don't have a primary knowledge of the fact of existence, no other conceptual knowledge is possible. Until we form, at least implicitly, some kind of conceptual grip on existence itself and existence as independent from consciousness. And those are the two primary axioms that we're going to start with in chapter 1 here: the existence and consciousness and their relationship. That's the key. In fact, one could almost define the whole of philosophy as the study of the relationship between consciousness and existence. One could absolutely, in fact, that may be the best way, I think, of most precise way of defining what makes philosophy separate as a subject, the relationship between consciousness and existence. And there has to be a specific relationship. If, for example, there is no existence, if, for example, all of reality is the product of my consciousness, and the extreme philosophical case of this is solipsism, then, of course, you're just a part of my imagination. You really don't exist, Michael. You're just part of my consciousness. Then what I've done is I've separated the relationship between consciousness and existence, and therefore thereby disabled my consciousness. If there is no reality against which to evaluate my ideas, if there is no independent reality by which to evaluate my ideas, I have no way to evaluate my ideas. And no one's ideas are superior or more valid or more correct if there is no reality against which to measure my consciousness. So, for example, I make a simple mistake. How do I know I've ever made a mistake if there's no reality out there which can say, oh, no, Jim, you made a mistake. There are 3 oranges on the table, not 5, as you expected. If there is no independent reality, there's no way to judge my ideas as being true or false, useful or not useful. Reality must set the standard, must set the agenda. Or as Ayn Rand put it in the context of metaphysics, she quoted Francis Bacon: nature to be commanded must be obeyed. And that includes within our own thought. I've got to submit to reality, and that's the only way I'm ever going to ferret out error. I'm going to know whether or not my consciousness is operating validly. Consciousness cannot be assessed. The quality of my ideas, the truth of my ideas, cannot be assessed if I don't have as a starting point, the absolute existence of an independent reality. And take the opposite view. Let's say you take what we call the primacy of consciousness.
Okay, don't go there yet.
Okay.
Hold your horses.
You've trained me to not try and not anticipate.
Just for one second. So I don't want to get too technical into technical analysis of the philosophy,
Yeah.
because for that they can tune into the Ayn Rand Center UK. When are you doing those, Jim?
Yes, in a couple of weeks. On every Sunday, we do seminars, and we've been covering Ayn Rand's works. We've been covering all of Leonard Peikoff's courses, and one of the things we're going to be starting at the Ayn Rand Center UK for paid subscribing members. Here, you guys are getting it for free, but our focus is going to be different. In a couple of weeks, we're going to be going through this in a philosophical way, putting it together as a philosophy. Now, of course, that's vital because, as Dr. Peikoff just explained in the beginning of the book, philosophy is the one topic that no one can avoid. You can be a doctor, a lawyer, a scientist, an artist, a politician. I don't care what you do. Philosophy is the one subject that no one can abstain from because the condition, our answers to the questions of metaphysics and epistemology and where values come from, will influence everything else. Literally everything else we know is conditioned by our basic philosophical understanding of these things. Um, so yeah, we're focused here, and the subject we're going to be focused on is its relationship to your life, your psychology, your happiness, self-improvement. And just consider what happens to you from the inside out if you reject the absolute that is reality.
Okay, hold that there now.
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to be. I'd say that we're not going to get technical, and I wanted to give the directions if they want to get a real technical analysis. But I don't think that I can skip over, although it's slightly technical, the axiomatic concepts. Now, Rand has three major axiomatic concepts: existence, consciousness, identity. Now, what makes them axiomatic, self-evident, is that they can't be denied without using them. What that means is that in any sentence that a person utters, it is taken for granted that something exists, that that thing has identity, and that the person speaking about it is conscious of those things.
I wouldn't quite put it that way. I'm not taking for granted. That would be the second step when I'm defending it against objections.
No, 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 no. I'm
Instance,
saying I don't know, Jim.
in
You're going too far.
Let me make one point.
Can I say it first so that you don't
Sure.
correct me when you don't need to?
Okay.
I'm not saying that's how you discover them. I'm saying that's what makes them axiomatic.
They are the only three, and not just the major three. They are the only three true axioms. Why? Because the content of them is present in every instance of consciousness, every instance of
Yes.
And so there are very basic concepts which are very fundamental to our later development of knowledge, and that's what metaphysics is. Metaphysics is looking back at the chronological and logical development of our knowledge, and these three are present in every instance of consciousness. As Dr. Peikoff puts it here, there is something of which I am aware. There is something of which I'm aware. Existence, identity,
Right.
consciousness. Now, very basic concepts like entity or action are just as obvious, but they are self-evident, but they are not present in every instance of perception. So, what distinguishes existence, consciousness, and identity is that they're absolutely ubiquitous. I look out, and every time I open my eyes, existence, consciousness, identity, existence, consciousness, and identity. This permits us to take them for granted because we don't need to really name them. We're not putting a pin in it because they're always there. But that failure to put a pin in it can cause problems as I move up the conceptual ladder down the road.
So
Make sense?
no, it absolutely does. I just want to be clear that when I first said that, what I'm talking about is that's what makes them axiomatic, is the fact that they can't be denied. They have to be assumed. They're implicit and present in everything. We learn them from observation.
Of knowledge.
But I also, Jim, I really don't want to get too technical, but there are other axioms. But these are the basic axioms in objectivism, because Leonard even states entity is axiomatic, and later on free will is axiomatic. So I don't want to give the wrong impression.
By axiom, what we mean in that context is fundamental and at the base of knowledge.
Yes.
Those are the two things that happen. They're self-evident, directly perceivable.
Yeah.
Now, not everything has free will. I do. So
Right. And
every
we'll get to that later. I just want to be, just so nobody gets confused about what we're
well, one
talking
could
about.
put, in fact, one could put at the axiomatic level all the evidence of sense perception. All of it is equally valid and self-evident. If I see a patch of green over there, even before I have the concept green, I'm perceiving existence. So consciousness and existence and identity are already implied in that. The content, not the conceptualization, and I would distinguish the two. An axiom is our first conceptualization of this basic, ubiquitous fact of reality.
Okay. Now I want to get to the difference between the primacy of consciousness and the primacy of existence. So, by putting existence first, we're saying that our minds do not control reality. Reality has to dictate the contents of our consciousness. We have to adjust our thought process to what actually exists. The reason this is important is because if I run around and think that my thoughts are going to, the world's going to bend to my will, then I'm not going to take the appropriate actions. I'm not going to know what appropriate steps to take. Again, nature to be commanded must be obeyed. We have to recognize which comes first and which doesn't, and adapt ourselves to reality, to the what she calls the metaphysically given. Just elaborate a little bit, Jim, but remember always to put the special emphasis on its relevance to our self-improvement.
Right. Well, imagine it is true that you can't form any other conceptual knowledge until you've conceptualized the axioms. Every word I use as Aristotle understood, every word I use implies the law of non-contradiction. When I say horse, I mean horse and not banana. And if my words are to have a single word to have any meaning, must accept. And Ayn Rand would fill it out by saying, well, non-contradiction, that means identity, that means existence. In fact, that means a relationship between existence and consciousness. So all of my conceptual knowledge rests upon this. Now, it rests upon it, as I said, implicitly. But if I don't take that implicit knowledge and make it explicit and come to understand that those concepts form the basis of my knowledge, I can get really screwed up. Imagine the condition of the ancient superstitious person. To them, if an earthquake happens, the gods may have been displeased. We've irritated the gods. Now think about gods and God in general, or spirits in general, governing the universe. Here are people who believe that consciousness has primacy, maybe not their consciousness, but some other ruling consciousness, like a god, gods, the spirits, something like that. If you believed in that version of the primacy of consciousness, you'd walk around in terror. And for that, all I need to do is cite supernatural horror movies. If you really believed in the world of Rosemary's Baby or The Exorcist or, something like that, think of the terror in which you'd live. At any moment, you could be, the laws of reality can be violated. We'll get to causality, which is a corollary of our axioms, and we should understand the relationship between strictly speaking, the metaphysical axioms and corollaries. The law of identity has implications, and all we need are the concepts of entity and action, and then we're off the ground in making our case that nothing happens except in accordance with the nature of the thing that acts. And if we've got that, then I know that the universe a pumpkin can't suddenly turn into Abraham Lincoln, or I can't get to the moon by just flapping my wings. But if you believe in the primacy of consciousness, even if it's not your consciousness, right? We, as babies, we learn the primacy of existence by distinguishing it from our own. Some unpleasant reality, I've used the example before, and we cover up our eyes, we open it, the unpleasant reality did not just go away because I refused to see it. No, reality, existence has primacy over my consciousness. And if I were to go around thinking that all I have to do is evade and that fixes the problem, then I'm a first person. Let's put it that I'm stuck at the first person. My consciousness rules reality. But if you think about it, there's other forms like collective consciousness. Is it acceptance? Now, there are all kinds of people out there who tell you scientific consensus is in fact our guide to reality. Well, it is not. Scientific consensus, whether it's phrenology or whatever, whatever other ideas that they have, Lamarckian evolution. If you think that a consensus, scientific consensus, like we were talking in our logic discussion about the logical fallacies, if you go for an argument for authority or you go from an argument for ad hominem, what you're saying is whatever is the ruling consciousness is what determines reality. So there's different forms of the primacy of consciousness. In every single form, they have terrifying implications. They turn reality into not the regular thing that we can understand, that's governed by rules and laws, and governed by the actions of things are not governed by the nature, the identity of the thing that's acting. Then what we've done is we've accepted a magical or supernatural worldview. That would be utterly terrifying. It may be that most of the time things happen in what appears to be causality, but for a religious person, at any time a miracle can happen. Boom! And I'm possessed by a demon, or you're pregnant by the devil's child, or
Oh
boom,
no.
there's vampires. So imagine the terror that a superstitious person has when an earthquake happens. Are the gods punishing us? Oh my God, how do we appease the God or propitiate the God? So we better find a way of appeasing the ruling consciousness. This is similarly with the collective version of the primacy of consciousness. Okay, I'm utterly dependent on the consciousness of others in terms of knowing. If my knowledge depends upon an opinion poll, then instead of looking at reality, what I'm doing is looking at what people are thinking down the line. So in effect, I live in a world of terrifying, miraculous changes. Take for example, we talk about the primitive superstitious person. That same kind of out of control superstitious fear or anxiety can occur to you even if you're a modern philosopher of science. Take Thomas Kuhn, his famous book on the philosophy of science, the structure of scientific revolutions. Okay, there's a consensus, a paradigm that gets developed, and then when we learn something new, we throw out the whole paradigm. That's a form of the primacy of consciousness, our understanding of reality. Take these postmoderns, take these deconstructionists. There's no truth. If I tell you something, even the author doesn't know his true agenda. He's creating a narrative, and that narrative can be adjusted. And all it is, that's a form of the primacy of consciousness. This anti-ideology business is actually saying, well, no, consciousness rules, and all we have to do is control the narrative. And that separates us from reality. And this allows people, for postmodern Marxists, for example, to believe in their magical economics without any reference to reality, because after all, this narrative is satisfying to a number of people. Okay, that will leave you again in a terrifying worldview where the opinion of your neighbor is what you have to appease, just like the ancient superstitious caveman was trying to appease the primitive god. If you're a first person primacy of consciousness person, then you are completely unmoored and you're now knocking on the door of psychosis. You're just a figment of my imagination, or you're just a product of my consciousness. If I direct my consciousness in a different way, and actually that's the description of how schizophrenics will often look at it. The world is projected from my perception of it. You are the creation of my consciousness. That is actually the schizophrenic's worldview. And so philosophers take modern art, detached from representationalism. What are they doing? They're saying my consciousness, okay, is in effect the ruling thing. There's no reality. Picasso can give you a face in 16 different dimensions that doesn't, from 16 different angles, which doesn't conform to our perception, pointing out, our perception is just an illusion. The thing is as I feel it, you see. My feelings are what govern the metaphysical truth of this matter, is the direct implication of modern art. But for things like the primacy of consciousness, you couldn't have splotches and Jackson Pollock or a big orange circle, and they call that profound art. Whether it's the nonsense, the fraud of how do you get away with the fraud of modern art? Primacy of consciousness. Well, the experts know. In fact, art is what the experts say is cool, right? And so some dumb millionaire will spend hundreds of thousands on some work of art because some expert says it's true. Now, does it give him emotional satisfaction apart from the fact that he's pleasing his colleagues, that he's bought what the agreed upon expert thinks is fine art? No, you see, you are without values, you are without truth, you are subject to the minds of others. Your mind, the contents of your mind, is subject to the minds of others, or you're at the metaphysical whim of a God who can perform miracles at the drop of a hat. And every
Yeah.
earthquake could be God punishing us.
So, Jim, if all that were true, other than unless there's a first person primacy of consciousness, then self-improvement is literally impossible because any
Even
steps that I take can be done by somebody else.
precisely correct.
Yeah.
There is no self-improvement possible. The really eloquent example of denying the axioms comes in both the denial of the primacy of existence, but an outright denial of the axiom of consciousness. Take the behaviorist psychologists like B.F. Skinner. They say there's really no consciousness. It's a epiphenomenon, a useless causal, has no causal impact. Consciousness can be ignored, introspection can be ignored. All we need to do is worry about behavior because we're all just a collection of atoms bouncing around like billiard balls on a table. If you deny consciousness, the power of thought, now consider that from a psychologist standpoint. Therapy is really beside the point. This talking cure thing, I can get you to think whatever I want you to think. Thinking has no impact on consciousness. If you're a strict behaviorist, think of it. We had to go through a whole, the first generations of the science of psychology have to go through a whole series of undulations before we get to cognitive behavioral psychology, which says that thinking is relevant to human psychology. Because what are they doing? They're denying that consciousness is anything metaphysically real or efficacious. These people tend to be determinists and materialists, and so they deny the power of introspection, the reality of introspection, or the power of the mind. Now, how do you improve yourself? How you're writhing about on your shrink's couch, how on earth are you going to get out of it unless there's a reality against which I can base
Right.
truth upon? So how do you measure psychological health? If cognition, the correct apprehension of an independent reality, is not your standard, then you've thrown out the first and most basic test of psychological health.
So, Jim, it goes back then, psychological health ultimately is the proper relation of the human mind to existence.
Beautifully put.
Right. Okay. So now, we talked about existence, consciousness, and identity. So identity means that a thing is what it is. And as you alluded to, a corollary of that is it means that a thing acts in a certain way, according to its nature, according to its identity. This is causality. Ludwig von Mises once said that, or wrote, if cause and effect didn't exist, a person literally could not act. Because there'd be no way. I couldn't take my next step because who the hell knows? Maybe my foot turns into a balloon. Maybe the ocean turns into, the ground turns into an ocean or quicksand. There's an elephant comes running.
Plan? How could you
could not
engage in long-term behavior or even immediate short-term behavior? How could I know that, picking up my coffee cup will deliver a sip of coffee to my mouth if I'm not and that's the thing. Most knowledge at the perceptual level, immediately conceptualized, and I'm not just talking about sheer sense perception, but most of our basic concepts from reality are in the context of certainty. I know that if I lift, and I learned this way back when I was a small child, that if I lift the cup and bring it to my mouth, I can actually get a sip of coffee. But if the rules of cause and effect don't apply as they do, how would I walk across a room? How would I brush my teeth? How would I walk to a single location? If I walk in the direction of Megara, I'm going to get to Megara. But if I didn't believe in causality, well, I could walk in the direction of Corinth. I could walk in the direction of Sparta, and it wouldn't matter. If I didn't have identity as an axiom and as applied to action, causality as identity applied to action, how could I do anything?
You couldn't, Jim.
I could.
It's like, so if I'm a carpenter, I'll give a couple examples. If I'm a carpenter and I want to be a better carpenter, I have to understand shapes, relationships, how different things interact with each other, how different woods respond to different things that I might be doing, to different tools, what type of saw interacts with the given wood, what types of fasteners best hold this thing together. I have to recognize causality through and through. The same thing if I want to be a better podcast host. I have to understand the tonality of my voice. What tone of voice is most likely to be heard and received by other people? What arguments are the best to be made? What microphone is going to work best with the given computer that I have? There's an abundance of relationships, causal relationships, that I have to understand. If I want to be a better friend, I have to understand the identity of the friend with whom I'm interacting with. What does that person like? What does that person respond to? What should I look for in a good friend? In order to put forth the proper causes, I have to understand what the effects of these actions are
And
going to
even when
be.
I don't yet know the cause, I have to be convinced that causality is universally applicable, or I don't stand a chance of ever understanding
Right,
that.
because maybe in this case it doesn't, and then how would you ever know?
And then I'd feel the terror and anxiety
Exactly.
that would come about from the causeless, the miraculous. At any given moment, some miracle could intervene. And, it would be like living in I don't know if you know the old Bugs Bunny, excuse me, Roadrunner Coyote cartoons. And their metaphysics is causality itself is set against the poor coyote. No matter what he does, it's going to, just get the coyote get the roadrunner, the coyote is going to be thwarted in doing it. If that were the case, you would be helpless in a chronic state of anxiety. And more than that, you wouldn't be able to even address, brought something up, the nature of my friend. One of the things that Ayn Rand it really makes, that is a point she makes that is super revolutionary. Consciousness has identity. It exists just like everything else exists, and therefore it too is specific, limited, finite, possessed of a certain identity. It operates by certain means, and we have to attend to a certain method of knowing if we're going to know. Now, in the context of psychology and self-improvement, this is absolutely vital. If I don't introspect, if I don't consider my past, if I don't consider the trauma that I went through, then how on earth can I possibly begin to undo the impact of that trauma? How can I possibly undo a bad habit? You know, Alcoholics Anonymous did a really great thing in adopting the Christian theologian's serenity prayer. And for this purpose, there's really, in metaphysics, we're only going to be talking about the first part of it. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Ayn Rand herself endorsed this. She quickly ran into,
Yes.
I wouldn't pray and I'm an atheist, but
Yeah.
what an insight.
Right.
Accept the stuff we can't accept. That's metaphysical
Now,
absolute reality.
well, I want you to pause, Jim. Can
But
you pause for a second?
Sure, but if you don't have a grip on the absolutism of reality, you're not even going to begin.
Yes. That prayer is phenomenal, and it's actually highly relevant to the next point, and that's why I wanted you to hold on.
Okay.
The last thing I want to say in relation to just the topic of causality, to anticipate later on when we get to ethics. The entire point of ethics is the fact that we don't come equipped knowing what to do. So ethics, the purpose of ethics is to show us the values and virtues that are going to allow us or give us the best chance at surviving and thriving. But the only way that we can learn the proper principles of action and the proper things that we should be pursuing is if we understand causal relationships.
Yeah.
What is likely to produce what result, or what will absolutely produce what result. Now, Jim, the prayer, and I'm going to give you a chance to really elaborate now, it's very important. The prayer that you just put forth, while I don't think it's actually in OPAR, it was actually in the essay that Ayn Rand wrote, which Leonard Peikoff alludes to here, and that is the difference between the metaphysical and the man-made. And this is an absolutely crucial distinction for people to understand who really want to improve themselves. Is you need to understand the difference between the metaphysically absolute that cannot be changed and the man-made which can. That's what that prayer That's why Rand liked that prayer. So just elaborate on this difference now, the metaphysical and the man-made.
We'll get more to it when we get to the subject of volition, free will, and
Sure.
the basics of ethics. But in this context, it's really important to understand that what I'm capable of is already metaphysically delimited. In other words, I can't perform miracles any more than miracles can happen on their own in reality. So, what's within my ability to do is highly constrained, right? Metaphysical, given my nature, given the nature of the things that I'm interacting with, that's a given, and that all has to be respected, all of it. Now, the metaphysical has to be accepted passively. That is to say, I have to take that as the given. There's no stamping of my foot, no wishing it were otherwise when it comes to either 1 + 1 = 2 or my own consciousness, I cannot change my nature as a conceptual being. I cannot change that. That is my basic means of knowing, and and therefore my basic means of survival. I can't change that about myself. More than that, as an individual, there are things about me. Let's say I really had an idyllic childhood in a lot of ways. Not that it was perfect, but it was an idyllic childhood. But let's imagine I had a childhood of trauma. For me to evade that would not allow me to deal with that trauma. I would be incapable of dealing with past traumas if I did not accept the primacy of consciousness and the identity of consciousness. My consciousness not only has the identity I share with all other human beings, and that must be obeyed. I must follow the correct method, a reality-based method, one based on the truth of the axioms, if I hope to connect with and remain consistent with reality. But more than that, if I'm looking into myself and I'm trying to improve myself and change myself, I cannot fake myself. I cannot fudge, fake a reality about myself. I have to accept a great cognitive psychologist of the 20th century said, change begins with self-acceptance. And what a profound insight that really is. I cannot begin the process of changing my character, changing my emotions, changing myself if I'm not aware of what I am in the first place and accepting it for what it is, submitting to the existence that my consciousness as it is now is. Only then. But I don't want to pour in concrete the stuff that I can change. In other words, my appreciation for existence will tell me when and to what extent I can, and I should be realistic with myself about how quickly that change will come, the steps I have to take in making that for the very process of change. If my consciousness were infinitely malleable, if it weren't something, if it didn't have an identity, well, then I could snap my fingers and I could turn myself into whatever psychology I preferred. It doesn't work that way. I have a given context. I have a born in first nature, as Aristotle might say, but then my thinking and my actions have created in me a second nature. And if I don't recognize both of those things, I can't adhere to the first part of the serenity prayer, can I? I have to accept the things that I cannot change, recognize the things I can change, but are there. Changeable though they are, that's me right now. And maybe, even if it is man made, even if it is the product of some childhood evaluation I made that is very, very difficult to change, maybe I just have to accept that and say, okay, I can't alter that part of me. Let's improve the things I can change about myself. And so, how does anyone approach the subject of psychology or self improvement without a firm view of the absolute independent nature of existence? I can't evaluate whether I'm psychologically healthy, whether my cognition is accurate, whether what I'm doing is doable, whether what I'm doing will actually achieve the ends that I want. None of that introspectively is possible. See, it's not just in extrospection, but in introspection that we have to accept that existence exists and that A is A, and that your consciousness has a specific identity, and that identity, to be commanded, must be obeyed.
So, as people, whatever point in their development that they're at, this next passage that I'm going to read, it's going to be the last one that we're going to discuss. And to me, it's absolutely vital. And that is this. He says, respect for reality does not guarantee success in every endeavor. The refusal to evade or rewrite facts does not make one infallible or omnipotent. But such respect is a necessary condition of successful action, and it does guarantee that if one fails in some undertaking, he will not harbor a metaphysical grudge as a result. He will
Yeah.
not blame existence for his failure. Now, I've often told people that, when people get at me about the objectivist ethics, for instance, well, you say it's in your own interest, but there's no guarantee that this or that's going to be in your own interest. And what I say is they misunderstand life. Life is ultimately deals in probabilities. It's like a guy who, you can eat right your whole life and get all the exercise you want. You die of a heart attack at 45. Does that mean that we then turn around and say good diet and exercise are irrelevant? No. We understand that the probabilities are that this is going to enhance our lives. So
It'll
I just want you to elaborate
multiply.
on this principle
Yes.
for us.
The health, I love the physical health analogy because it's an excellent one. You say to yourself, not only will I have my odds of living longer be greater, but my quality of life, my health, my energy level, my ability to do the cool things I want to do will be enhanced. And so not only are my odds of living longer going up, the life that I do have, however finite, will be dramatically improved to the extent that I accept this. And in fact, it's conditioned by that, isn't it? Necessarily. So, yeah. The simple fact is that it is I'm not omniscient. I'm not infallible because guess what? Consciousness possesses identity. It's limited. It's specific. I can't fake it. I can't fudge it. I can't do magical things with my consciousness. I can't snap my fingers and turn myself into give myself a different personality. I have to work at it. And that work consists of thinking. Now, how do I evaluate correct thinking? On the primacy of existence. How do I evaluate the change itself? The primacy of existence. I couldn't even begin to do approach any of that if I didn't have a firm grip on causality, if I didn't have a firm grip on identity, if I didn't have a firm grip on consciousness, if I didn't have a firm grip on consciousness's relationship and its subordinate relationship to the absolute of existence. In fact, psychological health, one thing you can say, what is psychosis? Psychosis is a detachment from reality. How does one define even, okay, I'm having a paranoid delusion right now. How would I know that? If I couldn't distinguish hallucinations or dreams or simple errors from the truth, how do I begin to improve myself? Those are preconditions of psychological improvement. Those are preconditions of starting where I am. And I don't judge a man's I don't morally evaluate his goodness or badness based on the absolute place where he is right now, but where he's come from and the direction he's heading in. That tells me something a whole lot more about the man's moral stature. I know his absolute achievement might be different, and I can evaluate those. But what makes a moral and a morally perfect human for me is the fact that this person is acting as best as he can within the parameters of the absolute of existence and the identity of his consciousness. And both have to be taken into account. And if you can't separate those out, if you can't see, okay, my consciousness is not functioning properly, how would I know that without the primacy of existence? My properly functioning consciousness must be measured against my knowledge of reality. And the demands I can make on its self-improvement have to be measured against my actual context. Is this something easily changeable? Can I improve this? Do I have to act on it if it's not good for me? Understanding my consciousness possessing identity is also instrumental to any self-improvement. The two main mistakes that people make, metaphysically speaking, are idealism, and this is a specific context in metaphysics, but idealism, consciousness is what rules, or materialism. That is to say, only matter exists, consciousness is either non existent or inefficacious. Both of those make impossible psychological improvement. I will repeat, both of those make impossible psychological improvement. If my consciousness is merely the result of my brain cells jiggling and chemicals squirting in my brain and certain electrical activity, then of course my thoughts are not, I can't evaluate my thoughts as being true, false, good, bad, efficacious, non-efficacious. Materialism makes impossible an understanding of consciousness for obvious reasons. If I think consciousness rules everything, then I have no standard by which to evaluate the functioning of consciousness. That is to say, I'm having psychotic delusions, I'm having hallucinations. Well, what would that even be? Or I say, this obsessive behavior is interfering with my happy life. How would I know that if I didn't believe in the absolutism of reality? No, I can't do without reality, and I can't do without consciousness. And I can't do without understanding that consciousness is subordinate to reality. Any mistake along those lines makes introspection non-objective, makes self-improvement impossible. And the only way I have to have any kind of standard of mental health is to know whether my cognitive faculty is operating correctly. And to do that, I have to assume the primacy of existence. Now, as I say, you can range from the terrified, superstitious person huddling in a cave in the Pleistocene era because thunder is striking and maybe the gods are mad at us. So I'm living in a world of total terror where some consciousness can come punish me for reasons I don't understand or reward me for reasons I don't understand. So I have to propitiate that consciousness. Or it can be the modern behaviorist materialist who says, yeah, well, thought's really a myth, or it's irrelevant, or it's just some epiphenomenon that has no causal efficacy. Therefore, really what we need is behaviorist behavior control, in effect, controlling people, which is, of course, a formula for totalitarianism, by the way. But whether you are submitting to the ruling consciousness of the universe and therefore living in this world of superstitious fear, where you really don't know what to do to improve your life. Now imagine the psychological state that you're in that condition. Or consciousness is really just, now consider the huge stolen concept. B.F. Skinner's writing books and developing theories about how consciousness, books and theories about how consciousness is really just a myth and has no impact. But he wants his book to have an impact on other psychotherapists and theorists, right?
Yeah.
In any case, you can't do without existence. You can't do without an understanding of identity, that things are what they are and can only act according to their nature, or consciousness and the relationship between consciousness and existence and identity. All three of those are necessary premises for getting any process of self-improvement off the ground. And in fact, any departure from that almost per se is psychological illness. If I just have simple, I did psychosis. Now let's do neurosis. Let's say I have social anxiety and there's no real reason for it. I'm not, I'm a decent human being, but every time I walk into a party, I have this creeping fear. Well, it's a fear not of some specific thing happening to me. It's my lack of self-esteem that I can manage the situation. That requires a firm realism. If I don't have realism, there's no way I can overcome my social anxiety. I can't tell myself, no, look, they're laughing. They're not laughing at me. Or no, every time I talk to a girl, she's going to think I'm a dweeb. No, if I walk into a party like that, I'm going to feel this weird anxiety. Everyone thinks I'm weird. Everyone thinks I'm, no. It's realism that alone can start pulling you away from that social anxiety, that can start pulling you away from that obsessive compulsive behavior. See, that's not helping you in reality. In fact, because it's based on a cognition of anxiety, if I don't have perfect order, I'm now out of control. In effect, that's a form of the primacy of consciousness, isn't it? So what I have to do in order to improve, to begin any process of psychological self-improvement is accept the axioms and accept the primacy of existence and accept the absolute that is causality. Otherwise, I'm shivering in fear like some caveman afraid of the gods, or I'm some behaviorist writing theories about how consciousness doesn't exist and we're all just a bunch of squirting glands. Okay, both would behaviorism renders any kind of therapeutic talking cures, Freud once called it, impossible. Impossible. What's the point of psychotherapy if there's no consciousness, Dr. Skinner? And on the other hand, if there's some consciousness whimsically controlling the whole universe, I'm going to be in a state of total neurosis because I can't tell you what's going to happen next. A Noah flood might happen to punish me because I've displeased God. Neither can be formulas for happiness or security. No, neither can be. So I would say that it is being the preconditions of all further conceptual thought. The axioms are also, and for the same reason, the absolute preconditions for psychological self-awareness or self-improvement.
I will just sum up the episode if I can. While it's not an exact summation, I think it is a relevant one. We cannot change what we will not acknowledge. And Jim, tell the people where they can find you. Tell them about ARC UK. Let them know.
Well, if you want a deep philosophical dive in those technical issues that we've sort of been dancing around here, starting in about 2 weeks, we will be diving into OPAR from a more technical philosophical standpoint. And there we will be talking about how we get it from reality, how we validate it in the first place, and contrasting it to other philosophical viewpoints in the history of philosophy. So please do become a paid member of Ayn Rand Center UK. We're going to do a much longer discussion and a greater, deeper dive. Each of these chapters, each of these subsections of the chapters will get it their own individualized attention, in particular, in contrast to other philosophical viewpoints. What we're doing here is, as you could probably tell, is focusing on how each of these aspects is critical to the process of self-improvement, how it relates to human psychology, and our desire to be happier, more successful people.
And where can they find you personally, Jim?
I'm sometimes on a thing called the Capitalist Corner, some
Yes.
podcast that some nut does, most days. Anyway, I'm also on this Rational Egoist from time to time, and I am at Facebook. I'm active on social media, at least Facebook, almost every day, answering questions. James Valliant at Facebook, so hit me up over there.
Awesome. And we will be back next week to deal with sense perception and volition. Thank you very much, Jim. And thank you, the audience, for joining us today. I really appreciate it. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Leibowitz. Till next time.